My true story from San Jose, California. Abused in church. The priest who betrayed me. My daughter is 59 years old, and strangers still stop her on the street. You look just like someone I used to know, they say, and I watch her face change because she knows exactly who they mean. For 60 years, I've watched my child carry the face of the man who violated me. Today, I'm finally ready to tell the world whose eyes my daughter inherited. Welcome back to Granny Dorothy's Stories. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Your support truly encourages me to continue sharing these incredible tales with you. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love hearing from my sweethearts around the world. My name is Eleanor Murphy, and I'm 77 years old. I'm sitting here in my kitchen where I've kept more secrets than I've shared meals, and that's saying something after nearly 8 decades of living. This story I'm about to tell you has been locked inside me for 60 years. 60 years of silence. 60 years of shame that was never mine to carry. 60 years of protecting a predator while that same silence slowly destroyed me from the inside out. People ask me why I never spoke up before, why I waited until now when I'm an old woman with one foot already in the grave. They don't understand that speaking the truth about what happened to me wasn't just about finding my voice. It was about risking everything I'd built my life around. It was about facing a community that chose to believe in the goodness of a monster, rather than the pain of his victim. For 6 decades, I convinced myself that keeping this secret was protecting everyone else. I told myself I was protecting my family from shame, protecting my community from the devastation of learning who their beloved leader really was, protecting my daughter from knowing the horrible truth about how she came to exist. But I was wrong. I wasn't protecting anyone except the man who destroyed my innocence when I was just 17 years old. You see, when you're violated by someone the entire community sees as a saint, when you're hurt by someone who speaks for God himself, the world becomes a very confusing place for a teenage girl. When that same violation results in a pregnancy that serves as living proof of what happened, and that child grows up looking exactly like your abuser, every single day becomes a reminder of the worst moment of your life. But it also becomes something else. It becomes evidence. Undeniable, walking, breathing evidence that some secrets are too dangerous to die with. My silence didn't protect anyone. It only protected him. Every year I stayed quiet was another year he could point to as proof of his good character. Every decade I remained silent was more time for his reputation to grow stronger, for people to see him as the devoted servant of God rather than the predator I knew him to be. My fear became his shield, and I can't let that shield protect him for one more day. If stories of survivors finally finding their voice after decades of silence resonate with you, please hit that subscribe button. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we've been avoiding our whole lives. I need you to understand something before I continue. This isn't a story about a moment of weakness or a mistake or a misunderstanding. This is a story about calculated evil disguised as holy service. This is about a man who used his position of trust and authority to systematically destroy the lives of innocent children, while building a reputation as a pillar of the community. The man who violated me didn't just steal my body that night. He stole my ability to trust, my relationship with faith, my sense of safety in the world. He stole my family's belief in me, my community's support, and my own understanding of right and wrong. And then he walked away without consequences while I spent 60 years carrying the weight of his crimes. Have you ever carried a secret so heavy that it felt like it was crushing your soul? Let me know in the comments, because understanding that weight is crucial to what I'm about to tell you. Today that changes. Today I'm taking back the power that was stolen from me 60 years ago. Today, I'm speaking the truth that a predator tried to bury with religious authority and community silence. Today, I'm honoring that 17-year-old girl who was too scared and confused to fight back by fighting back now with everything I have left. This is the story of what happened to me when I believed that men of God could do no wrong. This is the story of how one man's evil destroyed not just my life, but shaped the life of my innocent daughter for 6 decades. This is the story of how a community's willingness to protect an institution became more important than protecting a child. And this is the story of how, at 77 years old, I finally found the courage to speak a truth that should have been spoken 60 years ago. It was 1965 and I was 17. So innocent that I thought the worst thing that could happen to a good girl was missing Sunday service. Our little town of Millbrook had 342 residents and a faith so deep that questioning religious authority was like questioning God himself. My family had been pillars of St. Mary's Community Center for 3 generations. We weren't just churchgoers. We were the example other families looked to for true Christian living. I was what you'd call a model Christian teenager. I led the youth choir, organized fundraising drives, and spent Friday nights at fellowship meetings instead of drive-in movies. While my classmates listened to the Beatles, I memorized scripture and planned youth activities. I didn't see this as sacrifice. I saw it as privilege, a sign that God had special plans for my life. My dreams were simple but profound. College, teaching, maybe missionary work someday. I had straight A's, perfect attendance, and the respect of our entire religious community. At 17, I was both mature for my age and incredibly sheltered. I could organize retreats for 50 teenagers and give speeches to adults about faith, but I'd never been kissed or even held hands with a boy. This combination, spiritual maturity paired with complete physical innocence, would make me the perfect victim. That's when Father Thomas McKenna arrived at St. Mary's, transferred from the state capital. He was young for a priest at 32, with thick dark hair, kind brown eyes, and a smile that made everyone feel like the most important person in the room. Within weeks, he'd transformed our youth ministry. Attendance tripled. Parents were thrilled. Here was a priest who understood young people. And Father McKenna seemed to take special interest in me. It started innocently. He'd seek me out after meetings, complimenting my leadership and spiritual insights. "Eleanor, you have wisdom beyond your years. God has truly blessed you with special gifts." Coming from someone I respected so deeply, these words made me feel honored in ways I'd never experienced. He began asking me to stay after meetings for planning. "I need someone I can trust with important details. Someone who understands the spiritual significance of what we're accomplishing." Being chosen as his right hand felt like the greatest honor imaginable. Father McKenna started talking about college, offering to write recommendation letters. With my endorsement, you could get into any Christian college in the country. You could study theology, become a teacher, maybe return here to lead this community. That's when the special mentoring sessions began. "Eleanor, you're ready for more advanced spiritual guidance. The kind of instruction most young people aren't mature enough to handle." These sessions would be in his office, weekday evenings when the building was quiet. Intensive spiritual direction requires focus and privacy. I felt incredibly honored. My parents were thrilled. "Father McKenna is taking such personal interest in your spiritual development," my mother said with obvious pride. The early sessions were everything I'd hoped, discussing complex theology, exploring faith questions. Father McKenna made me feel intelligent and spiritually mature. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the conversations began to change. He started asking more personal questions about my relationships, whether I'd been tempted by worldly desires, how I maintained my purity. "It's important that I understand where you are spiritually so I can guide you properly." The questions became more intimate, focused on my body and physical experiences. He'd ask about my monthly cycles, whether I'd experienced impure thoughts, whether I'd been tempted to touch myself inappropriately. These conversations made me uncomfortable, but I trusted Father McKenna completely. If he said these topics were important for spiritual development, they must be. "God created your body as a temple," he'd tell me. "Understanding that temple is part of understanding God's design for you as a woman." He explained that many Christian women were afraid of their own bodies, but I was mature enough to understand the sacred nature of physical creation. He began having me come more frequently. Twice a week, then 3 times, then almost every evening. The touching started, his hand on my shoulder, touching my arm to emphasize points. Physical contact is important in spiritual guidance. Jesus himself used touch to heal and teach. The touching became more frequent, more lingering. He'd rest his hand on my knee during theological discussions, brush my hair from my face when I read scripture, place both hands on my shoulders during prayer. Every time I felt uncomfortable, Father McKenna would explain why this was normal. You're learning to overcome the false shame that society places on the human body. You're developing a mature, Christian understanding that most people never achieve. He started talking about our sessions as sacred secrets. This kind of intensive direction is very personal. Other people might not understand the advanced nature of our discussions. They might misinterpret the depth of our theological conversations. This made perfect sense. I could see how others might be envious of the individualized instruction I was receiving. Keeping our sessions private wasn't about hiding something wrong. It was about protecting something sacred. Father McKenna isolated me from peers in subtle ways. He'd schedule sessions during social gatherings, give me assignments that required missing youth activities, speak privately about concerns regarding other teenagers' spiritual maturity. You're operating on a different level now, he'd tell me. The activities that used to challenge you probably feel juvenile. That's normal. You're growing spiritually beyond your peer group. He was right. I felt disconnected from other teenagers. Their concerns about homework and dating seemed trivial compared to the deep theological concepts I was exploring. I began seeing myself as more mature, more spiritually advanced, more chosen than other young people. This isolation made me completely dependent on Father McKenna's approval. He became not just my spiritual mentor, but my primary source of intellectual stimulation and emotional validation. His opinion mattered more than anyone's, including my parents. I was the perfect victim because I was trying so hard to be the perfect Christian. My obedience became my vulnerability. My faith became my trap. My desire to serve God became the very thing that delivered me into the hands of a monster. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you ignored your own instincts when something felt wrong? Understanding how predators exploit trust is crucial to protecting ourselves and the people we love. The annual summer youth retreat was the highlight of our religious calendar. Father McKenna had made me his primary assistant in organizing the entire event. 35 young people registered, and I'd helped plan every detail. Friday night went perfectly. Welcome dinner, opening worship, small group discussions about growing in grace. After evening activities concluded and participants settled into their sleeping areas, Father McKenna asked me to stay behind for cleanup and Saturday preparation. Eleanor, I'm so grateful for your help. You've demonstrated real leadership. I think this weekend will be transformational, partly because of your contributions. His praise made me glow with pride. As we worked in the fellowship hall, he continued praising my spiritual growth and discussing my college future. I've been thinking about advanced theological study opportunities, programs that could prepare you for real leadership roles in Christian education. But first, he continued, I think you're ready for a different kind of spiritual experience, something that will prepare you for the deeper mysteries of faith. He disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 glasses of fruit juice. I thought we might pray together about your future. God wants to reveal something special to you tonight. The juice was cold and sweet, with a slightly different taste than dinner's punch. I drank it gratefully. Cleanup work had made me thirsty. As Father McKenna prayed aloud for my future, I found myself feeling unusually relaxed and peaceful. But something was wrong. Within minutes, I began feeling strange and disoriented. The room seemed to spin, and I had trouble focusing on his words. My thoughts felt slow and confused, like thinking through thick fog. Father McKenna, I don't feel well. I think I should go lie down with the other girls. When I tried to stand, my legs felt weak and unsteady. The room tilted, and I had to sit back down. Everything seemed dreamlike and unreal. It's all right, Eleanor. His voice seemed far away. Sometimes when God is preparing to reveal something special, we can feel overwhelmed by His presence. Just relax and let yourself be open to whatever He wants to show you. What happened next exists in my memory as fragments, Terrible, frightening pieces of sensation and confusion that I couldn't understand at the time and have spent 60 years trying to forget. I remember his hands moving over my body in ways that felt wrong. I remember trying to protest, but my voice wouldn't work. I remember wanting to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I remember him saying terrible things about how this was God's will, how I was receiving a special blessing, how this was spiritual preparation. I remember feeling pain and violation and terror I'd never experienced. But most of all, I remember feeling completely helpless, completely powerless, completely unable to make it stop. When I woke the next morning, I was on a couch in his office, covered with a blanket I didn't remember. My clothes were disheveled and my body ached in ways I didn't understand. I felt sick and disoriented. Father McKenna was at his desk reading his Bible as if nothing had happened. "Eleanor, how are you feeling? You had quite an experience last night. I was worried about you." I tried to remember what happened, but my memories were fragmented. I knew something terrible had occurred, but couldn't piece together clear events. What happened to me? I remember feeling sick and then, I can't remember clearly. "You were overcome by the Spirit," he explained with gentle authority. Sometimes when God is preparing to reveal something profound, the human body can't handle the intensity. You were receiving a very special spiritual experience, the kind only the most mature believers are ready for. His explanation made sense given everything I'd been taught about spiritual experiences. If Father McKenna said that's what happened, it must be true. But I feel so strange. My body feels different. And I have terrible fragmented memories that don't make sense. That's completely normal. Spiritual experiences of this magnitude can be disorienting. The memories you think you have are probably symbolic representations of spiritual truths God was revealing. Your human mind is trying to process divine revelation. But I knew something was terribly wrong. The aching wasn't from spiritual revelation. It was from physical violation. The fragmented memories weren't symbolic. They were glimpses of actual events my drugged mind couldn't process clearly. "Father McKenna, I think something bad happened. I think someone hurt me." His expression became more serious. "Eleanor, I'm worried about you. The spiritual experience was very intense, and I think it left you confused about reality. Sometimes powerful revelations create false memories or misinterpret normal spiritual sensations as harmful. I was with you the entire time, praying over you and keeping you safe while God worked in your spirit. Nothing bad happened, Eleanor. What you experienced was a blessing, not trauma." Father McKenna's explanation was delivered with such authority and compassion that I wanted to believe him. The alternative, that this trusted man had drugged and violated me, was too terrible to accept. It would mean my entire understanding of safety and religious authority was wrong. So I accepted his version, even though every instinct screamed that something terrible had happened. I chose to believe my pain was spiritual rather than physical, my confusion divine rather than drug-induced, my memory symbolic rather than literal. If you're finding this story helpful in understanding how predators manipulate victims after assault, please subscribe. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we've been avoiding our whole lives. "I'm sorry," I told him, ashamed of my doubts. "I didn't mean to question what God was doing. I guess I'm not mature enough to understand experiences like this." "Don't apologize. Your confusion is understandable. Most people would be overwhelmed by the revelation you received. You're struggling to process it shows how profound it was." He convinced me that whatever happened was my fault, that I'd somehow tempted him or misunderstood a spiritual moment. The shame and confusion kept me silent for 60 years. That manipulation, that gaslighting, that complete destruction of my ability to trust my own experience. That was almost worse than the violation itself. Because it meant I would spend the next 6 decades questioning my own reality, carrying shame that was never mine to bear. 2 months had passed since that terrible night at the youth retreat, and I was desperately trying to convince myself that Father McKenna had been right, that what I'd experienced was some kind of spiritual revelation rather than the violation my body kept telling me it was. But my body wasn't cooperating with my attempts to forget. It started with small things I initially dismissed as stress. I was more tired than usual, falling asleep during study sessions despite getting plenty of sleep. I had waves of nausea that would hit suddenly, usually in the early morning or when I smelled certain foods that had never bothered me before. The nausea was particularly confusing because it wasn't like any sickness I'd ever experienced. It would surge over me without warning, leaving me dizzy and weak, then disappear just as suddenly. My mother noticed I was picking at my food during meals. "Eleanor, you're getting too thin. Are you feeling all right?" I would assure her I was fine, just focused on college preparations. The truth was, I didn't understand what was happening to my body because I didn't know how to explain changes that filled me with growing anxiety. But it was the missing periods that finally forced me to confront the truth I'd been trying so hard to avoid. I had always been regular as clockwork since starting at 14. Every 28 days, tracked in a small calendar my mother had given me. When September came and went without my expected period, I wasn't too concerned. I'd heard stress could affect cycles, and I'd certainly been under pressure with college applications. But October passed with the same absence, then November. By December, I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. 3 missed periods wasn't stress. It was something much more serious and terrifying. The realization crept over me slowly, like a nightmare becoming more vivid as you become aware you're dreaming. I had a vague understanding of pregnancy. I knew married women sometimes had babies 9 months after their weddings. But my knowledge was limited to basic biological facts, filtered through the modest language my conservative religious community used for such matters. What I knew about pregnancy came from whispered conversations between married women at church, carefully worded explanations from my mother about couples expecting a blessing, and biblical accounts we studied in Sunday school. I understood pregnancy involved married couples doing something private that resulted in babies, but the specific mechanics were a mystery. More importantly, I knew with absolute certainty that pregnancy happened to married women who had been intimate with their husbands. It didn't happen to 17-year-old virgins who had never been kissed. It definitely didn't happen to good Christian girls who had dedicated their lives to purity. But as December turned to January, and my body continued changing in ways that terrified me, I could no longer deny what was becoming obvious. My breasts were tender and swollen, my waist was thickening despite decreased appetite, and I was experiencing bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. The most frightening part wasn't just the physical changes. It was knowing that these changes meant something catastrophic for my future. Even with my limited understanding, I knew unmarried girls who became pregnant faced social disgrace, family shame, and complete destruction of their reputations. Such girls were often sent away to distant relatives, returning months later with vague explanations that fooled no one. By February of 1966, I could no longer hide the changes, even from myself. My clothes were getting tight around the waist, and I was having to make excuses for why I couldn't participate in certain activities. I knew I needed medical confirmation, but the thought of going to our family doctor was terrifying. Dr. Matthews would feel obligated to inform my parents immediately. Instead, I made a decision requiring more courage than I thought I possessed. I would go to a doctor in the next town, someone who didn't know me or my family. I told my parents I was visiting a college friend, and took the bus on a cold Saturday morning in February. The doctor I found was Dr. Sarah Chen, chosen because she was a woman and located where I was unlikely to encounter anyone who might recognize me. When Dr. Chen asked if I was sexually active, the question hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to say no, then closed it, unsure how to answer. According to everything I understood, the answer was definitely no. But something had clearly happened to me. I don't think so, I finally managed. You don't think so? Either you have engaged in sexual intercourse or you haven't. This isn't something you would be uncertain about. I felt my face burning with shame. I know this sounds impossible, but I've never been with anyone like that. But something happened to me a few months ago and I'm not sure. I was unconscious or confused, and I don't remember everything clearly. After her examination, Dr. Chen delivered the news I'd been dreading. You are approximately 5 months pregnant. The baby is due sometime in July. But that's impossible, I said, panic rising. I told you I've never been with anyone. I'm still a virgin. Dr. Chen's expression was clearly skeptical. Young lady, pregnancy doesn't occur through immaculate conception. You have obviously engaged in sexual intercourse, whether you want to admit it or not. But I don't remember consenting to anything like that. Something happened at a church retreat, but I was told it was a spiritual experience. I was confused and disoriented. I think someone might have given me something to drink. I understand that unwed pregnancy can be frightening, especially for someone from a religious background. But making up stories about being drugged isn't going to change your situation. I left Dr. Chen's office in worse despair than before. Now I had medical confirmation, but also the crushing realization that even healthcare professionals would reject my story. I decided to confront Father McKenna directly. On Tuesday evening, I found him in his office preparing for youth activities. Father McKenna, I need to talk to you about what happened at the retreat. I need you to tell me the truth about what really happened to me. Of course, Eleanor. Though I thought we had already discussed your confusion about that night. I'm pregnant, I said bluntly, looking at his face. I'm 5 months pregnant. And the only time anything could have happened was that night when you told me I was having a spiritual experience. For just a moment, Father McKenna's mask slipped. I saw surprise, then calculation, then something like fear before he regained composure. Eleanor, I'm very worried about you. What you're suggesting is not only impossible, it's deeply troubling from a psychological standpoint. The gaslighting was immediate and intense. If you believe you're pregnant, you need medical care. But what you're suggesting about me indicates you're suffering from mental disturbance. I did see a doctor. She confirmed I'm pregnant. And I know the only time anything could have happened was that night when you gave me that drink. His voice took on an edge of steel I'd never heard before. You're making very serious accusations that could destroy an innocent man's life. I'm concerned that emotional problems are causing you to create false memories. Then explain how I'm pregnant, I said desperately. If you're truly pregnant, you must have engaged in sexual activity with someone and either forgotten or suppressed the memory because of guilt. When I insisted, I remembered fragments of that night. He became more threatening. You need to seek immediate psychological help. If you continue to spread these lies about me, there will be serious consequences. People trust me and respect my judgment. If I tell them you're suffering from psychological problems, they will believe me. Your reputation, your family's reputation, your entire future could be destroyed. That evening I told my parents. After dinner, in our living room where we'd had family devotions every night, I said the words that would change everything. I'm pregnant. I'm 5 months pregnant, and the baby is due in July. The silence was deafening. Shock, disbelief, horror, and shame passed across their faces. That's impossible, my mother whispered. You're a good girl. You've never even been alone with a boy. I know it seems impossible, but something happened at the youth retreat. Father McKenna gave me something to drink that made me confused, and then he violated me while I was unconscious. The reaction was immediate and devastating. My father stood up, his face a mask of anger. Eleanor Murphy, I cannot believe you would make such a disgusting accusation against a man of God. Father McKenna is one of the most respected priests in this region. The idea that he would do something so evil is not only impossible, it's blasphemous. My mother was crying. How can you say such terrible things about Father McKenna? He's been like a spiritual father to you. How can you repay his kindness with such horrible lies? They're not lies, I said desperately. I would never lie about something like this. But I could see my words were making them angrier and more certain I was either lying or having a mental breakdown. We're going to see Father McKenna right now, my father announced. We're going to get to the bottom of this. At the community center, Father McKenna's performance was masterful. He expressed shock and horror at my accusations, then compassionate concern for my obvious psychological problems. I was afraid something like this might happen. Eleanor has been showing signs of psychological disturbance for months. I've been trying to provide spiritual counseling, but I think she needs professional psychiatric help. So you're saying she's mentally ill? My mother asked with relief. I believe Eleanor is suffering from psychological disturbance that's causing her to create false memories and misinterpret normal interactions. It's not uncommon in young women under stress. Have you ever felt completely alone when you needed support the most? If this story resonates with you, please subscribe to help me continue sharing these important conversations about recognizing and preventing abuse. And that was it. The community's betrayal was complete. My own parents chose to believe a predator over their daughter. Father McKenna had successfully convinced everyone that I was mentally ill rather than the victim of his crime. I was 17, pregnant, and completely alone in a world that refused to see the truth. The weeks following that devastating confrontation in Father McKenna's office were the darkest of my entire life. Within days, it became clear that his threat to destroy my reputation hadn't been an idle one. He had immediately set to work poisoning the entire community against me, using his position of spiritual authority to spread the narrative that I was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. The change in how people treated me was swift and brutal. These were people who had known me since birth, who had watched me grow up in their church, who had praised my dedication and spiritual maturity just months before. Now they looked at me with a mixture of pity, fear, and disgust that made me feel like a pariah in my own hometown. Mrs. Henderson, who had been my Sunday school teacher for years, crossed the street when she saw me coming rather than have to speak to me. Mr. Patterson, who ran the general store and had always greeted me with warm smiles and questions about my college plans, now served me in cold silence. His eyes filled with the kind of judgment usually reserved for the town's known troublemakers. The other young people in our community were perhaps the cruelest of all. Teenagers who had looked up to me as a leader in youth ministry now whispered and pointed when I passed, their conversations stopping abruptly when I came within earshot. Some of them had clearly been told specific details about my psychological problems, because they would stare at me with the kind of morbid fascination people reserve for dangerous curiosities. But the most devastating change was in my own family. My parents, who had once been my greatest supporters and closest allies, now treated me like a stranger who happened to be living in their house. They spoke to me only when necessary, and even then with the careful, controlled tone people use when they're afraid of triggering an unstable person. My mother, who had always confided in me about household matters and community gossip, now fell silent whenever I entered a room. My father, who had been so proud of my academic achievements and spiritual leadership, could barely bring himself to look at me. The easy warmth and affection that had characterized our family relationships for 17 years had been replaced by a cold politeness that was somehow worse than outright hostility. The practical consequences of my situation were becoming impossible to ignore. My pregnancy was now visibly obvious, despite my attempts to hide it with loose clothing and careful positioning. By March, there was no concealing the fact that I was carrying a child, and the whispers and stares in our small community became even more intense. My parents made the decision that I would not be returning to school for the remainder of the academic year. It wouldn't be appropriate, my mother explained in the distant, formal tone she now used with me. It wouldn't be fair to the other students or their families to expose them to this situation. The loss of my education felt like another death. I had been an honor student with plans for college, with dreams of becoming a teacher and maybe even a missionary. Now I was a high school dropout with no prospects for the future, no way to escape the scandal that had engulfed my life. The isolation was crushing. I spent my days alone in our small house, forbidden from participating in community activities, cut off from my former friends, treated like a contaminated object by the only family I had. The walls of our home, which had once felt like a warm sanctuary, now felt like a prison where I was serving a sentence for a crime I hadn't committed. Father McKenna continued his ministry as if nothing had happened, but with the added aura of a man who had heroically survived false accusations from a troubled teenager. If anything, The community's support for him seemed to have grown stronger in the wake of my attack on his character. People praised his compassion in continuing to pray for my recovery, his forgiveness in not pursuing legal action against me for slander, his wisdom in recognizing my mental illness before it could cause even more damage. Meanwhile, I was growing larger and more uncomfortable every day, my body changing in ways that served as constant reminders of the violation I had suffered and the complete lack of justice or support I had received. The baby moved inside me, and each movement felt like a fresh betrayal by my own body, a physical manifestation of the trauma I was supposed to pretend had never happened. The question of what would happen when the baby was born loomed over everything. My parents had made it clear that keeping the child was not an option they would consider. "We cannot have a bastard child in this house," my father had said with brutal directness. "It would be a constant reminder of sin and scandal that would destroy what's left of our family's reputation." The word bastard had hit me like a physical blow. This innocent child, who had done nothing wrong, was already being labeled and rejected before it had even taken its first breath. The baby was being punished for the crimes of its father, just as I was being punished for being his victim. My mother had researched facilities for unwed mothers in distant cities, places where I could give birth away from the community and then surrender the child for adoption. These homes were typically run by religious organizations and were designed to handle exactly the kind of problem that my pregnancy represented, to hide away the evidence of sexual impropriety until it could be quietly disposed of. "It's the only way," my mother explained during one of our rare conversations about the future. "You can have the baby, give it to a family who can provide a proper home, and then try to rebuild your life. Maybe someday people will forget about this whole unfortunate episode." But I knew that people in small communities like ours never forgot scandals like this. Even if I managed to graduate from high school eventually, even if I somehow found a way to continue my education, I would always be known as the girl who had a mental breakdown and made false accusations against a priest. I would always be damaged goods, someone whose word could never be fully trusted, someone whose past would forever overshadow any future accomplishments. The physical discomfort of pregnancy was compounded by the complete lack of proper medical care. My parents were too ashamed to take me to Dr. Matthews for regular prenatal visits, and we couldn't afford to continue seeing Dr. Chen in the next town. I was essentially going through pregnancy without any professional medical supervision, relying on outdated books and my mother's vague memories of her own pregnancies for guidance. This lack of medical care wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. I had no way of knowing if the baby was developing properly, no way to monitor my own health during what was clearly a high-stress pregnancy, no way to prepare for potential complications during delivery. I was 17 years old, carrying the child of my rapist, and going through it all without any of the support systems that should have been available to me. The psychological impact was perhaps even worse than the physical challenges. I was dealing with the trauma of sexual assault, the betrayal by my community and family, the stress of an unwanted pregnancy, and the complete destruction of my future plans, all while being told by everyone around me that I was mentally ill and that none of my experiences were real. There were days when I almost began to believe them. The constant gaslighting, the unanimous rejection of my story, the complete lack of any validation or support, it all combined to make me question my own memories and perceptions. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe there was something fundamentally wrong with my mind that made me create elaborate fantasies about being victimized by a man who was only trying to help me. But then the baby would move, and I would feel the undeniable physical evidence of what had been done to me. I would remember fragments of that terrible night, the taste of the drug juice, the feeling of being unable to move or speak, the pain and violation that no spiritual experience could possibly explain. And I would know with complete certainty that my memories were real and that everyone else was choosing to live in a comfortable lie rather than face an uncomfortable truth. The spring months passed in a haze of isolation, discomfort, and despair. I watched through our windows as the community continued its normal routines. Young people preparing for graduation, families planning summer vacations, the usual cycle of church services and social events that had once been the center of my world. But I was no longer part of any of it. I had been cast out as completely as if I had been physically exiled from the town. Father McKenna continued to thrive in his role, seemingly unaffected by the accusations I had made against him. If anything, he appeared to be more beloved than ever, praised for his compassionate handling of a difficult situation and his Christian forgiveness toward a troubled young woman who had tried to destroy his reputation. Sometimes I would see him from our window as he walked through town, always surrounded by admiring parishioners, always radiating the warm charisma that had once made me feel so special and chosen. He would pass by our house without even glancing in our direction, as if I had ceased to exist entirely. The man who had destroyed my life had moved on completely, while I remained trapped in the consequences of his actions. By May, as my due date approached, the practical arrangements for my exile had been finalized. I would be sent to a home for unwed mothers in a city 3 hours away, where I would stay until after the baby was born and placed for adoption. The story that would be told in our community was that I had been sent to a special facility for treatment of my psychological problems, and that everyone should pray for my recovery and eventual return to normal life. The night before I was scheduled to leave Millbrook, possibly forever, I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the remnants of the life I had once planned. My academic awards, my certificates of participation in various church activities, my carefully organized college application materials. All of it now seemed like artifacts from someone else's life, evidence of dreams that had been shattered beyond repair. I wrote a letter that night, addressed to no one in particular, documenting everything that had really happened to me. I wrote about Father McKenna's grooming process, about the night he drugged and raped me, about his threats and manipulation afterward, about the community's complete betrayal of their responsibility to protect an innocent child. I sealed the letter and hid it in a place where I hoped someone might find it someday, long after I was gone. If you've ever felt like your truth was being erased by people who preferred comfortable lies, you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button if this story is helping you understand how predators use entire communities to silence their victims. As I prepared to leave the only home I had ever known, carrying the child of the man who had destroyed my life, I made a promise to myself. Someday, somehow, I would find a way to tell my story. I would find people who would believe me, who would understand that a 17-year-old girl doesn't destroy her own life and her family's reputation for attention or out of mental illness. I would make sure that Father McKenna's crimes didn't remain hidden forever, even if it took decades to find someone willing to listen. But as the bus pulled away from Millbrook the next morning, taking me toward an uncertain future in a city where no one knew my name, I had no idea if that day would ever come. I only knew that I was 17 years old, alone in the world, and carrying within my body the permanent evidence of a crime that everyone had decided never happened. The home for unwed mothers was exactly as grim as I had imagined it would be. The Mercy Home for Unwed Mothers sat on the outskirts of the city like a fortress designed to contain shame. It was a sprawling brick building surrounded by high walls and carefully manicured gardens that might have looked peaceful if you didn't know what they were really for, to hide away the evidence of society's failures while maintaining the illusion that everything was being handled with Christian compassion. When the bus dropped me off at the front gate that May morning in 1966, I was carrying a single suitcase containing everything I owned and a belly that had grown so large I could barely see my feet. I was 17 years old, 7 months pregnant, and more alone than I had ever imagined possible. Sister Margaret, the nun who ran the facility, greeted me with a kind of brisk efficiency that immediately made clear this was a business operation disguised as charity. She was a small, stern woman in her 60s whose rimless glasses and tight mouth suggested that she had little patience for the kind of moral failures that brought girls to her door. "Eleanor Murphy," she said, consulting a clipboard as if I were inventory being received. "From Millbrook. Sent by Father McKenna with a recommendation for psychological counseling along with maternity care." She looked up at me with an expression that mixed disapproval with something that might have been pity. "You'll be in dormitory C, bed number 14. Meals are at 7, 12 and 6. No exceptions, no special requests." She handed me a thick booklet of rules and regulations. "Read this tonight. Every rule will be followed exactly, or you'll find yourself back on the street regardless of your condition. We run a respectable facility here, and we expect respectable behavior from our residents." The dormitory was a long, narrow room filled with single beds arranged in military-style rows. Each bed had a small nightstand and a narrow locker for personal belongings. The walls were painted institutional green and decorated with religious imagery. Crosses, pictures of saints, and inspirational quotes about redemption and forgiveness. My bed was between a 15-year-old girl named Mary who was 8 months pregnant and looked like she was about 12, and an 18-year-old named Ruth whose belly was so enormous she could barely move. Neither of them spoke to me when I arrived, and I soon learned why. The unofficial rule among the residents was that you didn't ask questions about how anyone had ended up here, and you didn't volunteer information about your own situation. The daily routine was rigid and designed to keep us busy from dawn until lights out. We were awakened at 6 a.m. for morning prayers, followed by breakfast, then assigned to various work details around the facility. Some girls worked in the laundry, others in the kitchen, others maintaining the gardens or cleaning the administrative areas. The work was hard and constant, designed as much to exhaust us as to keep the facility running. Afternoons were devoted to what they called rehabilitation activities. Classes on domestic skills like cooking and sewing, lectures on moral behavior and Christian living, and individual counseling sessions with Sister Margaret or one of the other staff members. These sessions were supposedly designed to help us understand how we had gone wrong and prepare us to make better choices in the future. The underlying message of everything at Mercy Home was clear. We were here because we had made sinful choices that had brought shame on ourselves and our families. The pregnancy was evidence of our moral failure, and the isolation from our communities was the natural consequence of our actions. The goal wasn't to help us heal from trauma or to address the circumstances that had led to our pregnancies. It was to contain us until the evidence of our sin could be disposed of quietly and we could be returned to society supposedly reformed. What made the experience even more cruel was that many of the girls really had made choices that led to their pregnancies. Some had been in consensual relationships with boyfriends who had abandoned them when pregnancy resulted. Others had been promiscuous or rebellious, acting out against strict upbringings in ways that had serious consequences. A few were repeat offenders who had been sent to Mercy Home multiple times. But scattered among them were girls like me, victims of rape, incest, or other forms of sexual violence who had been sent away not because they had done anything wrong, but because their presence was inconvenient for the adults who had failed to protect them. We were treated exactly the same as the girls who had genuinely made poor choices, expected to confess our sins and express gratitude for the opportunity to redeem themselves. During my individual counseling sessions with Sister Margaret, I initially tried to explain what had really happened to me. I thought that perhaps a woman, even a nun, might be more likely to believe that a teenage girl could be the victim rather than the perpetrator of sexual misconduct. Sister Margaret, I said during our first session, I think there's been a misunderstanding about why I'm here. I didn't choose to become pregnant. I was assaulted by Father McKenna at a church retreat. He drugged me and raped me while I was unconscious. Her reaction was swift and decisive. Eleanor, I've seen your file. Father McKenna has explained your situation thoroughly. You're suffering from psychological problems that have caused you to create false memories and make accusations against innocent people. Continuing to repeat these delusions will only make your condition worse. She leaned forward in her chair, fixing me with a stare that was both stern and strangely compassionate. The first step in your rehabilitation is accepting responsibility for your actions. Until you can acknowledge that you engaged in sexual behavior that resulted in pregnancy, you cannot begin the process of moral and spiritual healing. But I'm telling you the truth, I insisted. I've never willingly been with anyone. The only way I could be pregnant is if someone violated me without my consent. Sister Margaret's expression hardened. Eleanor, I've been working with troubled girls for over 20 years. I've heard every excuse, every fantasy, every attempt to avoid responsibility that you can imagine. Young women who find themselves in your situation often create elaborate stories to avoid facing the reality of their own poor choices. She opened a thick folder that contained my file. Father McKenna has provided me with detailed documentation of your psychological deterioration over the past several months. He's explained how you began making increasingly inappropriate accusations against him and other authority figures, how you became paranoid and delusional, how you started creating false memories of events that never occurred. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Father McKenna hadn't just silenced me in our community. He had created an official record of mental illness that would follow me wherever I went. He had documented a fictional history of psychological problems that made it impossible for anyone to take my accusations seriously. According to these reports, Sister Margaret continued, you've been struggling with a severe disconnection from reality that has caused you to interpret normal spiritual guidance as something inappropriate or harmful. This is actually a recognized psychological condition, and with proper treatment and moral guidance, it can be overcome. She closed the file and looked at me with what she probably thought was kindness. The good news is that you're young enough to recover from this psychological crisis if you're willing to do the work. But that work begins with accepting the truth about your situation and stopping these harmful fantasies about being victimized. I realized in that moment that my situation was hopeless. Father McKenna had been more thorough than I had imagined in his efforts to discredit me. He hadn't just convinced my community that I was mentally ill. He had created official documentation that would make it impossible for me to get help from anyone, anywhere. Any professional I encountered, doctors, counselors, social workers, would see his reports and immediately assume that I was delusional. Any attempt I made to tell the truth about what had happened to me would be interpreted as further evidence of my psychological problems. I was trapped in a narrative that painted me as mentally unstable, and every word I spoke in my own defense only made that narrative stronger. Over the following weeks, I stopped trying to tell my story to the staff at Mercy Home. There was no point in continuing to bang my head against a wall that would never move. Instead, I focused on surviving each day and protecting the innocent life growing inside me, even though I knew I would never be allowed to keep the baby. The other residents had their own survival strategies. Mary, the 15-year-old in the bed next to mine, had been raped by her stepfather but had been sent away when her pregnancy became obvious because her mother chose to believe her husband's denials rather than her daughter's accusations. Ruth, on the other side, had been sexually abused by multiple members of her extended family, but was being treated as if she were promiscuous rather than victimized. We learned to recognize each other without speaking about it directly. The girls who were here because of genuine assault or abuse carried themselves differently than those who were here because of consensual relationships gone wrong. There was a particular kind of shell-shocked emptiness in the eyes of those who had been betrayed not just by their attackers, but by every adult who should have protected them. But even among ourselves, we rarely spoke about what had really brought us to Mercy Home. The walls had ears, and any conversation that contradicted the official narrative of our moral failure could result in punishment or extended stays. We communicated through glances and small gestures, offering each other the only comfort we could, the knowledge that we weren't completely alone in our suffering. The physical discomfort of late pregnancy was made worse by the facility's policies. We were expected to work until the very day we went into labor, regardless of how difficult our pregnancies became. Medical care was minimal and focused primarily on ensuring that we delivered healthy babies that could be placed for adoption, not on our own comfort or well-being. I developed severe back pain from the combination of pregnancy and the heavy physical labor we were required to perform. When I complained to the medical staff, I was told that discomfort was natural and that work was good for both my physical and moral health. When I had difficulty sleeping because of the baby's movements and my growing anxiety about the future, I was told that insomnia was a common result of guilt and that prayer would help more than medicine. The adoption process had been arranged before I even arrived at Mercy Home. I wasn't allowed to meet the prospective parents or have any input into the selection process. I was simply informed that a suitable Christian family had been chosen and that they would take custody of the baby immediately after birth. "It's better this way," Sister Margaret explained when I asked about the adoption arrangements. "Emotional attachment will only make the transition more difficult for everyone involved. The baby will go to a family who can provide a proper home with married parents and financial stability. You'll be able to return to your life without the constant reminder of your mistakes." The dehumanization was complete. I wasn't a 17-year-old girl who had been victimized by a trusted authority figure. I was a problem to be solved, a scandal to be contained, a source of shame to be hidden away until the evidence could be quietly disposed of. My feelings, my wishes, my trauma. None of it mattered compared to the need to maintain the fiction that such terrible things didn't happen in good Christian communities. As July approached and my due date grew nearer, I tried to prepare myself mentally for what was coming. I would go through labor and delivery knowing that I would never see my child again after the brief moments immediately following birth. I would return to a community that had completely rejected me, with no education, no prospects, and a reputation that would follow me for the rest of my life. But perhaps worst of all, I would have to live with the knowledge that Father McKenna would continue his ministry uninterrupted, free to target other vulnerable young people while everyone praised him for his compassion and forgiveness toward the mentally ill girl who had tried to destroy his reputation. The baby was due any day now, and with each contraction that rippled through my body, I was reminded that soon I would have to face the most devastating loss yet, giving up the innocent child who was the only witness to the crime that everyone insisted had never happened. Have you ever felt like the entire system was designed to silence you rather than seek the truth? If this story is helping you understand how institutions can fail victims, please subscribe to support these important conversations. On a sweltering July night in 1966, as thunder rolled across the sky and rain lashed against the windows of Mercy Home, my labor began. And with it, the final chapter of my childhood came to an end. The contractions started at 3 a.m. on July 15, 1966. Pulling me from a restless sleep with a pain unlike anything I had ever experienced. At first, I thought it might be false labor. The medical staff at Mercy Home had warned us that many girls experienced practice contractions in the weeks before delivery. But as the pain intensified and developed a rhythm that seemed to sync with my racing heartbeat, I knew this was real. I lay in my narrow bed for over an hour, gripping the thin sheets and trying not to wake Mary and Ruth on either side of me. The dormitory was filled with the soft sounds of sleeping girls, and I didn't want to disturb them with what was about to become the most traumatic day of my life. These girls had become my only family over the past 2 months, and I wanted to protect them from witnessing what I was about to endure. But by 4:30, the pain had become so intense that I couldn't remain silent. I managed to make my way to the nurse's station, walking slowly and pausing every few minutes as waves of agony rolled through my body. The night nurse, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patterson who had the bedside manner of a drill sergeant, looked up from her paperwork with obvious irritation. "What are you doing out of bed, Murphy?" she asked, using the surname, only address that was standard practice at Mercy Home. We weren't individual human beings with names and stories. We were problems to be processed as efficiently as possible. "I think I'm in labor," I managed to say between contractions. "The pain started about an hour ago, and it's getting worse." Mrs. Patterson glanced at the clock on the wall, then at her clipboard. "You're not due for another week according to your file. Are you sure it's not just indigestion from dinner? Some of the girls get stomach upset from the cabbage." Even in my pain and fear, I was amazed by the casual dismissal. I was 17 years old, giving birth for the first time, terrified and alone, and the medical professional responsible for my care was suggesting that I couldn't tell the difference between labor pains and indigestion. "I'm sure," I said firmly, just as another contraction hit me so hard that I had to grab the edge of her desk to keep from falling. "Please, I need help." Mrs. Patterson sighed heavily, as if my going into labor was a personal inconvenience to her schedule. "All right, let me examine you and see what's happening. But if this is false labor, you're going back to bed and you won't be allowed out of the dormitory again until your actual due date." The examination confirmed what I already knew. I was in active labor and progressing quickly. Mrs. Patterson's demeanor shifted slightly from irritation to efficiency, but there was still no warmth or compassion in her manner. I was moved to the delivery room, a sterile white space that felt more like an operating theater than a place where new life was supposed to enter the world. "The doctor won't be here for another hour," Mrs. Patterson informed me as she prepared the room. "Dr. Williams only comes for deliveries, not for all the preliminaries. You'll need to manage until he arrives." Managing meant lying on a hard table under harsh fluorescent lights, wearing a thin hospital gown that provided no dignity or comfort, with no pain medication and no emotional support. The contractions were coming every few minutes now, each one feeling like it was tearing my body apart from the inside. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional agony of knowing that I was about to give birth to a child I would never be allowed to raise. A child who was the product of rape but would grow up believing they were the result of a teenage girl's moral failure. This innocent baby would carry the shame and stigma of illegitimate birth, never knowing that their conception was a crime rather than a sin. Dr. Williams arrived at 7 a.m., an elderly man with silver hair and cold eyes who treated the delivery like a routine medical procedure, rather than one of the most significant moments in a young woman's life. He examined me with clinical detachment, spoke only to Mrs. Patterson about my progress, and seemed to view me as nothing more than a vessel that needed to be emptied efficiently. First pregnancy, 17 years old, no complications expected, he said to the nurse as if I weren't in the room. Should be straightforward. Have the adoption paperwork ready for immediate signing after delivery. The next few hours blurred together in a haze of pain, fear, and institutional callousness. No one held my hand or offered words of encouragement. No one explained what was happening to my body or prepared me for what to expect. I was alone in the most vulnerable moment of my life, surrounded by people who saw me as a problem to be solved, rather than a human being experiencing one of life's most profound events. When the final stage of labor arrived, the pain became so intense that I thought I might die. But even worse than the physical agony was the knowledge that every push was bringing me closer to the moment when I would have to say goodbye to my child forever. At 2:47 p.m. on July 15, 1966, my daughter was born. The word daughter hit me like lightning the moment Dr. Williams announced the baby's gender. I had spent months thinking of the pregnancy in abstract terms, trying to protect myself emotionally by not imagining the actual child that would result. But hearing that simple word daughter shattered every wall I had built around my heart. For one brief, shining moment, I forgot about everything that had led to this moment. I forgot about Father McKenna and the rape and the betrayal and the exile. All I could think about was that I had a daughter, a little girl who was part of me and who needed me to protect her and love her. Can I see her? I asked desperately, trying to lift my head to catch a glimpse of the baby. Can I hold her? Dr. Williams and Mrs. Patterson exchanged glances, and I could see the calculation in their eyes. They were deciding how much contact to allow between me and my child, weighing the emotional cost against the practical need to maintain some semblance of medical protocol. Briefly, Dr. Williams said finally. But remember, this child is going to her real family tomorrow. Don't make this harder on yourself than it needs to be. Mrs. Patterson brought my daughter to me, wrapped in a standard hospital blanket that couldn't hide how perfect and beautiful she was. She had dark hair like mine and tiny fingers that moved constantly, as if she was already reaching for something she couldn't quite grasp. When I looked into her face, I saw my own features reflected back at me, but also something that was entirely her own, a fierce independence that gave me hope she would be strong enough to survive whatever challenges lay ahead. "Hello, sweetheart," I whispered, touching her tiny hand with one finger. "I'm your mama, and I love you more than you'll ever know." She opened her eyes at the sound of my voice, and for a moment, we looked at each other with the kind of recognition that transcends explanation. This was my child, my daughter, the innocent product of the worst thing that had ever happened to me, but also somehow the most precious gift I had ever received. I had perhaps 10 minutes with her before Mrs. Patterson took her away to the nursery. 10 minutes to memorize her face, to whisper words of love that she would never remember, to promise her that someday I would find a way to explain the truth about her conception and her birth. "I'm so sorry," I told her through my tears. "I'm sorry I can't keep you safe. I'm sorry I can't give you the life you deserve. But please know that giving you up isn't my choice. It's something that's being done to both of us by people who care more about appearances than they do about love." When they took her away, I felt like part of my soul was being ripped out of my body. The physical pain of delivery was nothing compared to the emotional agony of watching my daughter disappear through the nursery door, knowing that I might never see her again. The adoption paperwork was brought to me less than an hour after delivery, while I was still bleeding and exhausted and emotionally devastated. Sister Margaret appeared with a stack of legal documents and a pen, her expression mixing business efficiency with what she probably thought was compassionate urgency. "It's better to take care of this immediately," she explained, spreading the papers across my bed table. "The longer you wait, the more difficult it becomes for everyone involved. The adoptive family is ready to take custody tomorrow morning, and they're very excited about welcoming their new daughter." I stared at the papers through tears that made the words blur and swim. These documents would legally sever any connection between me and my child forever. Once I signed them, she would belong to strangers who had been chosen without any input from me, people I would never meet who would raise her with a fabricated story about her origins. "What will they tell her about me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They'll tell her that her birth mother was a young woman who made some poor choices but loved her enough to give her a better life with a family who could provide for her properly," Sister Margaret said in a tone that suggested she had given this speech many times before. "But that's not true," I protested weakly. "I didn't make poor choices. I was raped. She deserves to know the truth about how she was conceived." Sister Margaret's expression hardened. "Eleanor, we've discussed this repeatedly. Your continued insistence on these false accusations is exactly why you're not in a position to raise this child. The adoptive family doesn't need to know about your psychological problems. They just need to know that they're receiving a healthy baby from a young woman who wasn't able to provide proper care." The manipulation was so complete, so devastating, that I felt like I was drowning in it. Not only was I being forced to give up my child, I was being forced to participate in a lie about the circumstances of her conception. The truth about Father McKenna's crime would be buried forever, replaced by a story that painted me as irresponsible rather than victimized. But what choice did I have? I was 17 years old with no money, no education, no support system, and no way to care for a baby. Even if I refused to sign the papers, even if I somehow managed to keep my daughter, how could I provide for her? How could I protect her from a community that had already decided we were both sources of shame and scandal? With a hand that shook so badly I could barely hold the pen, I signed away my rights to my own child. Each signature felt like a small death, each document another nail in the coffin of any hope I had for justice or truth, or even the basic acknowledgement that I was a human being deserving of compassion. The next morning, I watched from my window as my daughter was carried out of Mercy Home in the arms of her new mother, a well-dressed woman in her 30s who held the baby with obvious joy and excitement. The woman's husband loaded a car seat into their sedan with the careful attention of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months or years. As their car pulled away from the building, taking my daughter toward a life I would never be part of, I felt something inside me break that would never fully heal. I was watching my child disappear into a future where she would grow up believing that her mother had abandoned her out of selfishness or irresponsibility, never knowing that I had been forced to give her up by a system designed to protect perpetrators rather than victims. 2 days later, I was discharged from Mercy Home with a small suitcase of belongings, a bus ticket back to Millbrook, and a fabricated story about my time away. The official narrative was that I had been receiving treatment for psychological problems at a residential facility, and that I was now ready to return to my community as a reformed and hopefully wiser young woman. But I wasn't returning to a community. I was returning to a place where I would forever be marked as dangerous and unreliable. I wasn't reformed. I was broken in ways that might never be repaired. And I wasn't wiser. I was simply more aware of how completely alone a person could be in a world that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The bus ride back to Millbrook was the longest journey of my life. With every mile that passed, I was traveling further away from my daughter and closer to a town that had rejected me completely. I was returning to parents who had chosen a predator's word over their own daughter's truth, to a community that had branded me as mentally ill rather than face the reality of what their trusted priest had done. Most devastating of all, I was returning to a place where Father McKenna continued to serve as a respected spiritual leader, free to target other vulnerable young people while everyone praised his forgiveness toward the troubled girl who had tried to destroy his reputation with her false accusations. As the bus pulled into Millbrook's small station on a hot August afternoon in 1966, I realized that my real punishment was just beginning. I had survived rape, betrayal, exile, and the forced surrender of my child. Now I had to learn how to survive a lifetime of silence, carrying the truth of what had happened to me while everyone around me participated in the lie that protected my rapist. If you've ever felt like the system was designed to protect the powerful rather than the vulnerable, please subscribe. Understanding how institutions fail victims is the first step toward creating real change. I was 18 years old, and my life as I had known it was over. The girl who had once dreamed of college and teaching and maybe even missionary work was gone forever, replaced by a young woman who would spend the rest of her life trying to find a way to live with truths that no one wanted to hear. But as I stepped off that bus and back into the town that had rejected me, I made a promise to myself and to the daughter I would never see again. Someday, somehow, I would find a way to tell our story. I would find people who would believe that a priest could be a predator, that a community could choose lies over truth, that a system supposedly designed to protect children could instead sacrifice them to preserve the reputations of adults. It would take decades, but that promise would eventually lead me here, to this moment, telling you the story that almost everyone who lived it wanted to keep buried forever. Returning to Millbrook felt like walking into a tomb where I was expected to live among the ghosts of who I used to be. The town looked exactly the same, but I was fundamentally changed in ways that made me feel like a stranger in my own hometown. My parents picked me up from the bus station in silence. The 10-minute drive home felt like crossing an ocean of unspoken accusations. When we arrived, my mother finally spoke her first words to me in months. "The story is that you've been receiving treatment for nervous exhaustion brought on by college preparation stress," she said without looking at me. "You're to resume normal activities gradually and avoid any behavior that might cause people to question your recovery." The message was clear. I was being welcomed back conditionally. I wasn't returning as their daughter who had survived a terrible ordeal. I was returning as a potential embarrassment who needed to be carefully managed to prevent further scandal. People who had known me since birth now looked at me with curiosity, pity, and wariness. They treated me like someone mentally fragile, speaking in overly gentle tones, avoiding topics that might upset me, watching my reactions for signs of instability. Father McKenna handled my return with masterful manipulation. He made public displays of Christian forgiveness that reinforced his innocence while highlighting my supposed mental instability. "Eleanor, I'm so glad to see you're feeling better," he would say in front of other parishioners. "I've been praying for your healing throughout your treatment. It takes real courage to seek help for psychological struggles." These interactions positioned him as the caring spiritual leader who harbored no ill will toward the troubled girl who had made false accusations. They reminded everyone that he was the authority figure whose word carried weight, while I was the unstable person whose perceptions couldn't be trusted. The most devastating part was watching him continue his work with young people, knowing that other vulnerable teenagers were being exposed to the same predator. But I was powerless to warn anyone. My credibility had been so thoroughly destroyed that any attempt to speak out would only be seen as evidence that my psychological problems were returning. I finished high school through correspondence courses, studying alone while my former classmates attended graduation. My dreams of college had evaporated. I found work at the local diner, serving coffee to people who whispered about me when they thought I couldn't hear. The isolation was profound and permanent. I couldn't form normal relationships because I was carrying secrets I could never share. I couldn't date because no decent young man would be interested in someone with my reputation. I couldn't even maintain friendships because every conversation felt like walking through a minefield of topics I had to avoid. Years passed with crushing monotony. I worked at the diner, lived in my childhood bedroom, attended church services where I had to sit in the same sanctuary as my rapist while he was praised for his spiritual leadership. I watched Father McKenna officiate at weddings, baptize babies, and receive awards for his dedicated service. He thrived while I survived. The worst part wasn't my own suffering. It was the growing certainty that I wasn't his only victim. Over the years, I noticed other young people receiving his special attention, showing subtle signs of trauma afterward. But the community's faith in Father McKenna was now stronger than ever, reinforced by his apparent victimization at my hands. In 1975, nearly 10 years after my assault, I witnessed Sarah Mitchell, a 15-year-old who reminded me painfully of myself, showing the same signs: confusion, depression, withdrawal. She had been receiving Father McKenna's special mentoring. When her behavior became obvious, she was diagnosed with the same psychological problems that had supposedly afflicted me and sent away for treatment. That's when I realized Father McKenna had created a perfect system for victimizing children, while ensuring that anyone who tried to expose him would be discredited as mentally ill. He had turned my own case into a template for silencing future victims. For years, I considered ending my own life. But something kept me going. Maybe the memory of my daughter, maybe the thought of other victims who might someday need someone who understood, maybe just sheer spite and the determination not to give Father McKenna the satisfaction of driving me to suicide. In 1982, 16 years after my assault, Father McKenna died of a heart attack. His funeral was a celebration that made me physically ill. I sat in the back pew, listening to testimonials about what a wonderful man he had been, knowing I was probably the only person there who knew the truth. In 1984, I moved to a city 300 miles away, where no one knew my history. For the first time in nearly 20 years, I could speak freely without every word being interpreted as evidence of psychological problems. I found work as a hospital aide and eventually became a patient advocate, someone who helped vulnerable people navigate the healthcare system and ensured their voices were heard. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had found my calling in protecting people who needed to be believed, especially since I had spent most of my life being disbelieved and unprotected. In 1995, when I was 46, a woman contacted the hospital looking for Eleanor Murphy from Millbrook. She was Jennifer, 29 years old. Exactly the age my daughter would have been. She had been adopted as an infant and was searching for her biological mother. The adoption records indicate my birth mother was receiving treatment for psychological problems, Jennifer explained during our first meeting. Hearing those same lies that had defined my life for 3 decades, spoken by my own daughter, was both heartbreaking and oddly liberating. Over the following months, I gradually told Jennifer the truth about her conception and birth, about Father McKenna's crimes and the community's betrayal. Jennifer believed me completely. My story explained too many inconsistencies in her adoption records. "I understand now why you couldn't keep me," she said. "Learning that you were raped, that the whole community turned against you. It explains everything." Having Jennifer believe me after 30 years of being dismissed as mentally ill was like being offered water after decades in the desert. For the first time since 1966, someone was validating my experience. But Jennifer wanted more than understanding. She wanted justice. She began researching Father McKenna's history, looking for other victims. What she discovered was both vindicating and heartbreaking. Over his 30-year ministry, Father McKenna had left a trail of damaged lives. Jennifer found at least 6 other women who had been victimized by him as teenagers, all of whom had been discredited or silenced. The pattern was consistent. Father McKenna would target vulnerable young people, groom them, assault them, then use his authority to discredit them if they tried to seek help. The institutions that should have protected these children instead protected him. In 2001, Jennifer helped me do something I had never thought possible. I told my story publicly for the first time in 35 years. We contacted a journalist who wrote a comprehensive article about Father McKenna's crimes and the systematic cover-up that had protected him. Several of Father McKenna's other victims contacted us after the article was published. For the first time in decades, I wasn't alone in carrying the truth. We formed a support group, sharing our experiences and helping each other heal from traumas we had been forced to carry in isolation. If you've ever wondered whether speaking your truth is worth the cost, please subscribe. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to let our stories be buried by people who value comfort over justice. Today, at 77 years old, I can finally say that I'm at peace with my life in ways I never thought possible. Father McKenna is dead and can't hurt anyone else. My daughter knows the truth about her origins. The other survivors and I have found each other and created the support system we should have had decades ago. The institutions that failed us have never fully acknowledged their role in enabling Father McKenna's crimes. But I've learned that healing doesn't require their acknowledgement. Healing comes from telling the truth, from being believed by people who matter to you, from refusing to let shame and silence define your entire life. My story spans nearly 60 years, from that innocent 17-year-old girl to the woman I am today. It's a story of how institutions can fail the most vulnerable people, how communities can choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, how survivors can be silenced for decades. But it's also a story of resilience, of the power of finally being believed, of the importance of breaking silence even when it seems impossible. The little girl I once deserved better than what happened to her. But the woman I became, who survived rape and betrayal and decades of forced silence, who eventually found her voice and her daughter and her truth, she's someone I can finally be proud of. That's the real ending to this story. Not justice in any legal sense, but the quiet triumph of refusing to let evil win completely, of insisting that truth matters even when it's inconvenient, of building a life worth living despite everything that tried to destroy it. Subscribe for more triumphant stories like this. See you in our next one.